The Association of the United States Army is pleased to welcome you to AUSA's Thought Leaders Webinar Series, a webinar series featuring military leaders and contemporary military authors. Kicking off today's webinar is AUSA's Executive Vice President, General Bob Brown.
Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the Association of the United States Army's Thought Leaders Webinar Series. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. And joining me today to discuss the Army's role in the Indo-Pacific are Admiral Scott Swift, U.S. Navy retired, former commander of U.S. Pacific Fleet. Admiral Swift served in the U.S. Navy for more than 40 years, rising from his commission through the Aviation Reserve Officer Candidate Program to become a Navy light attack and strike fighter pilot. He commanded at all levels, including FA-18 Weapons School, aircraft carrier-based squadrons, Carrier Air Wing, Carrier Strike Group, and the U.S. 7th Fleet forward deployed to Japan. Finally, completing his uniformed career as the 35th Commander of U.S. Pacific Fleet in 2018. Also joining us is Dr. Thomas Karako, Senior Fellow, International Security Program and Director, Missile Defense Project, CSIS. Dr. Karako is a Senior Fellow with the International Security Program and the Director of the Missile Defense Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. His research focuses on national security, missile defense, nuclear deterrence, and public law. Dr. Karako is also a fellow with the Institute for Politics and Strategy of Carnegie Mellon University. He received his PhD from Claremont Graduate University and his BA from University of Dallas. Our final panelist is Dr. Loren Thompson, Chief Operating Officer, Lexington Institute, and Chief Executive Officer of Source Associates. Dr. Thompson is Chief Operating Officer of the nonprofit Lexington Institute and Chief Executive Officer of Source Associates, a for-profit consultancy. Prior to his holding his present position, he was Deputy Director of the Security Studies Program at Georgetown University and taught graduate-level courses in strategy, technology, and media affairs at Georgetown. He has also taught at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. And to view the full bios of our panelists, please visit the Handouts tab on the right side of your screen. Also, if you have questions for our speakers today, and we hope you do, please use the Questions and Answer tab and post your question in the box at the lower right side of your screen. We're going to try to get to all the questions as best as we can in the time we have allowed. Well, we got a tremendous panel today, and I will tell you, just to sort of set the background, very timely for this thought leaders when you look at Department of Defense China's study just being completed, and of course the continued emphasis as Indo-Pacific as the priority theater for our nation. You know, the U.S. is facing unprecedented challenges to our national interest, and China and Russia, and yes, Russia is in the Pacific as well. I know when you Russia, you think Europe, but China and Russia in the Indo-Pacific are really challenging the rules-based international order. Increasingly more aggressive and assertive. And in fact, I would tell you in my 30 years experience, I saw where China went from being, having a fear and a respect for the U.S. military to where they don't fear us anymore. They still respect us, but they don't fear us. Adversaries have developed an asymmetric approach to undermine the strengths and exploit the weaknesses of our forces. An example would be the anti-access aerial denial capability, A2AD, to deny us access, obviously, and their investment in those systems. Well, for the Army, the key traditional roles remain, of course, the deterrence on the peninsula in Korea and the ability to fight and win large-scale combat operations there if needed. The Army is the foundation of the joint force as it supports with logistics, communications, medical, all the services in the Indo-Pacific. And then, of course, the great relationships as a majority of our allies and partners. The armies are in charge in their nations, and there's a tremendous opportunity to advise and assist and build those relationships. But change is needed in developing new roles that are key to deter, fight, and win in the future. So multi-domain operations, all domain operations, when you look at the Army's role to enable the joint force to be able to maneuver and prevail from competition, which is going on every day through conflict with calibrated force posture, multi-domain capabilities that provide that overmatch speed and range required. And that speed is speed of decisions and leading to a decision dominance, if you will. And certainly, again, the multi-domain aspects will set the conditions for the joint force to fight and win. Now, the U.S. has the most joint force in the world, but it's not joint enough. We've got to go from joint interdependence, where we depend on each other with single domain capabilities, to joint integration, where you can present multiple dilemmas, be in multiple domains, all domains key, and orchestrating those domains to give you an advantage and present multiple dilemmas to your enemy. And all domains are key. Of course, ground is the most survivable of the domains, and so it plays a key role. No single domain alone will work, but the complementary capabilities are key. As we look, you need more than one option. Again, as we are presented with these tough challenges from near peer and soon to be peer adversaries for certain. A great example of this is in multi-domain operations, the maneuver, a multi-domain task force, the MDTF. The ability to close a strait from the ground with land to sea capabilities, the ability to open establishing friendly A2AD and opening airways for friendly air and these capabilities. So we'll get into lots more of that, but just setting the background and setting the stage, the Army's role in the Indo-Pacific so critical. So let me start with our first panelist. We're going to go. He's Admiral Scott Swift is in San Diego, and I will just have to say that what a tremendous partner when we're both serving in the Pacific together. One of the smartest individuals I've ever known, and a great commander, great leader. Scott, over to you.
I was going to say nice things about you, Bob, but when you just said I'm one of the smartest individuals you ever know, my apologies to all your friends. Having said that, it was a great way to cap off a career in the military is working with so many incredible joint commanders there in the Pacific with yourself and Admiral Berger and General Shaughnessy. It was a great team. I would like to thank first, though, AUSA and all of their sponsors for putting this event on. I spent an awful lot of time speaking in forums like this, and I have to say, I'm going to try to keep my comment short because I'm most interested in what the other panelists had to say as well. It's a great team that you've pulled together. My sense is that we're going to get to the operational and tactical level in the Q&A, and I want to start at a higher level to make a few points, and that is the critical nature of a national strategy, something that I think that we lack. There are many people that argue with me on this point, and I think that the NSS's the national security strategy was a great step forward, but I think given the pure competition that we're in, it's still lacks sufficiency. And I think from that, the national defense strategy is a big step forward. But I see a lot of good things coming out of DoD and elsewhere, State Department as well, in helping make sure that we get this competition. I started talking a year and a half ago the importance of thinking strategically, plan operationally, acting tactically, and came from the perception I had that there were an awful lot of things planned and act tactically, and then wondering why we're having such a tough time with this competition. And expand that discussion beyond just the military to business and industry and the civil sector as well, and have found the same approach that people tend to think, plan, and act tactically, and question why they're not more competitive. And I think this panel helps drive that point home about the importance to elevate our thinking with respect to what's happening strategically and what the strategic goals are. Your comments about A2AD ring to that very point. There are some elements in doctrine that, in fact, the vast majority of doctrine I don't think needs to be changed. I think it's fully sufficient as it is. But it's important to revisit doctrine from time to time. I find myself returning to the core root of missions, functions, and tasks. Let's figure out what the missions are first. Let's then focus on what functions are necessary to enable that mission. And then from those functions, what tasks are necessary. It connects with that same focus of thinking strategically, planning operationally, and acting tactically. Bob and I were having a conversation a couple of weeks ago, and the subject of the Army being a break glass force. We should challenge those concepts regardless of what service we're in. In fact, I think it's easier for those of us that come from other services to speak up and suggest that's not the case. It certainly wasn't my experience that I've had with the Army, certainly in the Pacific. And it's counterproductive to the point that that Bob made with respect of being interoperable in a fuller sense than what we are right now. I'm also a bit frustrated, and why I'm excited about being on this panel, that it's a bit of an echo chamber out there, that people tend to repeat thoughts and beliefs that aren't fully well researched or founded in fact. And we just don't have the time for that. We need to get serious and focus on the problem sets that we have, study them deeply, and then apply solutions that we think have better application. I think it's important to note that this is, in my view, it's not a military competition. It's largely an economic competition that requires a whole of government approach. I've been concerned that we tend to lead with one of the 15 cabinet level departments, that being DoD. I do think that the pendulum has begun to swing the other way. I'm pleased that State Department is taking a much more consequential role in the competition, and I'm very pleased with things that SecDef is doing with respect to both China and Russia, and the comments that are coming out of DoD about the importance of the other challenges. What are those opportunistic challenges out there, perhaps manifest in Iran or North Korea, or terrorism is still out there as a stalking horse. And if we do get into a peer competition, I think we'd be foolish not to expect others would take advantage of that opportunity that is presented to them. Getting more to the specifics of how to think about the Pacific from a cross-service perspective, there are some things that I believe that were true when Bob and I were serving together and remain true today, and that is the critical nature of mobility and expeditionary mindset when it comes to operations. And when you're fighting a peer competitor out there, you have to be mobile and you have to be expeditionary. If you become static, then this is a home game for the enemy, and you become much more vulnerable. I think it's important that we need to remain a highly functioning force in what I think will be a highly contested logistics environment. The world that Bob and I and our peers lived in, and I think it's still true for those that followed along behind us, is that you're going to have to fight with what you have, and that fighting with what you have is going to last for a significant time period, certainly measured in months and not weeks. It comes back to the point on contested logistics. Really important to recognize fighting what you have also includes the resources that you have from a logistical perspective. And again, in the interest of time, I'll just close on this point, is that if it comes to a fight in the Indo-Pacific, the future really is now. It's important that commanders that are forward continue to inform service chiefs in the acquisition process about what is needed in the near term, 3 years and out at best, maybe longer than that. But it's focusing on how do we optimize with what we have, and the weapon system that is most critical in optimizing what we have is that system that resides between our ears, which is once again why I'm thrilled to be part of this panel. Back to you, Bob.
Scott, thanks so much. Admiral Swift, great opening comments. Appreciate it. Let's move to our second panelist, Dr. Tom Karako.
Well, thank you, General Brown, and thanks to the whole AUSA team for the opportunity to be here today. Today's subject is the Army's role in Indo-PACOM. Within that, I want to focus on the topic, one that has generated a little bit of controversy of late, and that's the role of ground-based long-range fires within the Joint Force. The Army appears to be leading the Joint Force with fielding timelines for PRISM, medium-range capability, and the long-range hypersonic weapon. But over the past 6 months or so, some commentators have suggested that the Army's efforts here represent an improper budget grab for funds they feel might be better allocated to another service. In one respect, this is a typical, predictable DC defense budget season type of thing. But behind these parochial interests lies something a little more serious. At issue is whether the Joint Force is capable of breaking the necessary programmatic, doctrinal, and budgetary China to meet the central challenge of our time. At issue is whether the entropy of service rivalry and outdated role and mission definitions will impede the emergence of a new joint warfighting concept. The central question is whether the military challenge posed by China is a hard problem or a very hard problem. The acting SecDef wrote 2 years ago that the scale and urgency of change required to restore conventional overmatch must not be underestimated. Now, I have no special personal attachment to the Army, but I do believe that critics of ground-based fires underestimate the gravity of the problem we face, and as such underestimate the scale and urgency of long-range fires needed. The Army didn't sneak out in the dead of night and decide on their own to do long-range fires. It was directed to do so by senior Pentagon officials. Nor did they do so recently. A decade of activities in the South China Sea, Ukraine, and elsewhere awakened our awareness of long-term strategic competition. The reorientation of grand and military strategy that was ratified by the Trump National Defense Strategy began in the late Obama years. Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work, for instance, challenged the services to go figure out how to offset the A2AD challenge. Slow marinating concepts like mosaic warfare and distributed lethality germinated into new service concepts: distributed maritime operations, multi-domain command and control, and multi-domain operations. In describing what was then called multi-domain battle at the 2016 AUSA conference, Bob Works said, quote, "We will mass effects from the air, the sea, and the ground, and under the sea, and will, quite frankly, pound the snot out of them from range and in the close fight. Multi-domain battle and cross-domain fires," he said, "get at the very heart of the changing character of war and how ground forces will be central, as they always have been, in the joint warfight," end quote. When the Army made long-range precision fires their top modernization priority, they did with the endorsement of senior Pentagon officials and all the surface secretaries and chiefs. Now, some third-party critics suggest that the Army, like the Marines, in their divestment of tanks in favor of the Army, that the Army should divest themselves of long-range strike in favor of the Air Force. Well, they're right about one thing. The Army should heed the example of the Marines. That is, not canceling long-range precision fires and long-range missile development, but doubling down on it. The Marines requested 40 Tomahawks in FY21, and this year are doubling down on ground-based anti-ship missiles. The Commandant's 2019 planning guidance slaughtered a lot of sacred cows because it recognized we are entering, in his words, a new era of missile warfare. Pull out a dictionary, and you'll find missiles defined as things which are sent. An era of missile warfare literally puts a premium on standoff capability. It's also curious that objectors to ground-based fires ignore completely that the U.S. just withdrew from the INF Treaty, a treaty that limited precisely that category of missiles. The reason justifying withdrawal was Russian violations. But the deeper cause and the need to act on that reason was the demand signal and capability gap that 500-kilometer plus ground-based fires can provide. The development of hypersonic weapons is helping to break down historical service stovepipes. The Army and Navy have been especially close in their co-development of LRHW and CPS. In fact, Mike White, the director of all things hypersonic for R&E, recently described this particular partnership as the model, complementing their attention to, quote, roles and responsibilities, end quote. That cooperation is further manifest in the Army's procurement of Tomahawk and SM-6. Opponents of ground-based long-range fires say it is the antithesis of jointness and throw down a penalty flag for a roles and missions foul. The implication is that the Army should sit in color and let others handle this job. You know, it's kind of funny. These arguments from the jointness police all seem to be aimed at helping one particular service. But guess what? China doesn't care about your penalty flags. Don't take my word for it. Listen to the vice chairman, General Hyten, who's pushed back on well-meaning partisan advocates of his own service. Their 1948 era arguments about roles and missions are outdated, he said, and what we need are concepts tailored to 2021. Nor do you need to take the word of senior Army leaders. Heed instead the counsel of recently departed Indo-Pacific commander, Admiral Phil Davidson. Just in April, he was pounding a congressional committee table calling for ground-based fires there. Now, we hear a lot about multi-domain, this, that, and the other thing. To cut through the jargon, pull out your dictionary again and look at the word's etymology. Multiple means many, specifically 3 or more. Those who say that 1 or 2 basing domains are enough not only forget that land is one of the domains, the domain on which human beings spend most of their time, they are also literally rejecting multi-domain fires. To be clear, each domain brings certain qualities or characteristics: stealth, promptness, cost, mass, and distribution. But no single domain excels at them all. Undersea fires are highly mobile and stealthy and penetrate A2AD bubbles from beneath. There's only so many Virginia payload modules to go around, however, and unarrested, the number of VLS tubes is in fact expected to decline dramatically in the coming years. Surface ships have great mobility and their visibility has a deterrent value, even while themselves being a target. And they are also limited by the number of VLS tubes and reloadability. Aerial platforms have the greatest speed and mobility and can be stuffed full with missiles. But as with ships, that mass is concentrated into clumps, and the range of their effectors still require penetration. It's great that the Aero hypersonic weapon is moving into procurement, even if it lacks the range of others. And while the B-21 bomber won't be here in numbers until some years, even then we won't be able to take its stealth for granted. That's another reason why the long-range standoff weapon is going to be so important for that leg of the nuclear triad, as are conventionally armed missiles like AIM-260 and the extended JASSM family. Mobile and relocatable ground-based fires can be distributed. And by virtue of being on land, they can be built in greater mass. They can also be pre-positioned forward, even though they lack the same stealth of subsurface fires. Manning is a limitation, but unmanned or minimally manned launchers can lower that requirement. And unlike high-value targets like bombers and ships, ground launchers carry fewer rounds apiece, broadening the attack surface. Deception can also help here. In fact, the Air Force can be a model to the Army in terms of mass and deception. The pursuit of attritable, unmanned systems like Valkyrie and Skyborg hold lessons for the Army's ground forces. One could, for instance, litter an archipelago with Connex boxes. Most would be empty, but some would not be. Cost matters too, but cost calculated for effects that are effectively, reliably, and promptly delivered, and the cost including platforms, not the marginal unit cost of accepting a munitions delivery. The saying goes that anyone planning for a large ground war in Asia ought to have their head examined. Cranial checkups might also be in order for planning to crack the Indo-Pacific A2AD problem with manned bombers and gravity bombs alone. But that seems to be the unstated assumption behind the cost comparisons made by proponents of the Air Force when comparing the procurement cost of an LRHW with a JDAM. The terrifying force of American air power is a beautiful thing, But as Bob Work so often warned, American bombers and fighters dominate only when they're in the air, not on the ground, when they're able to penetrate, and where they can land or be refueled. No one should be more grateful for American air power than soldiers on the ground. Conversely, no one should be more grateful for ground-based long-range fires than the pilots whose planes will be protected by the joint contribution to the SEAD mission. Argument by comparisons and analogies to Desert Storm seem especially inapt here. In the high-end context, ground and sea-based fires don't compete with air power, they enable it. Each of these characteristics are important, and this very hard problem means that we need to impose on our adversaries very hard dilemmas and very high costs. At the end of the day, this is indeed a question about roles and missions, but that question has to be asked and answered with reference to the new joint warfighting concept, not pushing back against it with old ones. Long-range fires has become a set of missions requiring strike missiles in the hands of each of the services from each of the domains. Once again, I just observed that it's kind of funny to hear folks say that the Army has only gotten involved in long-range fires in order to be relevant to Indo-PACOM. Well, I certainly hope so. If any service is not breaking China to contend with the long-term strategic competition, the central challenge of our time, then what the heck are we doing? Thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Karako. Appreciate those great opening remarks. Let's move to our final panelist, Dr. Loren Thompson.
Thanks, Bob. U.S. national defense strategy is largely secret, but was famously characterized by former acting Defense Secretary Pat Shanahan as being about China, China, China. Within that framework, the dominant concern of U.S. military planners is how to deter and/or defeat an effort by Beijing to occupy Taiwan. So that's where I would like to focus my opening remarks about the Army's role in the Indo-Pacific. Taiwan plays a pivotal role in U.S. strategy for the Western Pacific because it is the anchor of the first island chain that impedes Chinese expansion eastward. If it is occupied, Beijing will have broken out, dealing a severe setback to U.S. military fortunes in what has become the industrial heartland of the global economy. Now, prior to the recognition of the People's Republic in the early 1970s, the United States actually had 30,000 troops on the island. Today, it has none. In fact, there is no formal commitment on Washington's part to come to Taiwan's defense if it is attacked, although Taiwan's defense posture assumes that we will be coming. The challenge the Indo-Pacific Command faces is how to fashion conditions in which Beijing is deterred from attacking, or, if deterrence fails, how to defeat attacking forces without either side resorting to the use of nuclear weapons. Conventional wisdom has it that this task must fall mainly to the Air Force and the Navy. Unlike in Europe, the distances are great, and there are a few local allies on which America could depend. Furthermore, we have to assume that Chinese invaders would aim for an early decision that precludes U.S. ground forces from arriving before the island falls under Chinese control. However, there are big problems with depending on long-range air power and naval forces to deter Chinese aggression if we believe an invasion might occur in this decade. For starters, the Air Force only has 158 long-range bombers in its entire fleet, many of which are not available on any given day. And there are only a few bases within 2,000 miles of Taiwan from which those bombers can fly. I recently saw an article in a national magazine showing the 24 bases the Air Force plans to rely on in the future to spread its forces out in the Pacific. I was struck by the fact that half of the airports had runways shorter than a B-52 requires to take off. But that's just an aside. We cannot assume that the host nations for most of these bases would permit their use in a war, and we have no choice but to assume that China would move to disable the really good bases at the onset of war. It probably would not be feasible to sustain long-range air operations from places as distant as Alaska and Hawaii. And now here's a really important point that nobody at the Air Force Association seems to have thought about. we would have to think hard about the advisability of sending nuclear-capable bombers into Chinese airspace on conventional strike missions. That could lead Beijing to launch its modest nuclear arsenal for fear of being disarmed. As for the US Navy, it will find itself increasingly challenged by an environment around Taiwan that is thick with Chinese undersea, surface, and overhead systems capable of targeting our warships. Like the Air Force, the sea services will have a relatively small fleet of high-value warfighting assets to deploy near Taiwan in a war, and Beijing's ability to overwhelm their defenses is growing steadily. We tend to believe our submarines will be survivable. I have an article about that in Real Clear Defense today. But we should not assume that situation will continue indefinitely in waters close to China due to the proliferation of undersea and overhead sensors, especially those on drones. So, I conclude from these circumstances that America's ability to deter aggression by China against Taiwan is declining, and that Washington might lack the means to respond quickly if deterrence fails. The implication is obvious. We need fighting forces on Taiwan before aggression occurs, a tripwire force, not unlike the posture we already maintain in the Baltic states and in Korea. Subject to Taipei's approval, the United States should permanently station an Army armored brigade on the island, along with the supporting air defense and other elements to include long-range fires. One brigade might not be able to defeat an attacking force, but it would slow that force's progress, buying more time for other U.S. forces to arrive. More importantly, it would compel Chinese leaders to confront the fact their forces are likely to engage the U.S. military from day one of any invasion. This is precisely the approach we took to defending NATO's Central Front during the Cold War, and it had the effect of convincing Moscow that America would respond to an invasion. By scattering U.S. forces on Taiwan, they could be made nearly impossible to find, fix, and destroy by the enemy. This isn't so easy to do on the other nearby islands in the first island chain, which are much smaller than Taiwan's 14,000 square miles and all subject to restrictions by host nations. Moreover, the proximity of Taiwan to China means that Army road mobile fires would have a range of options for targeting enemy land forces and installations, not to mention maritime assets. Needless to say, the stationing of a U.S. armored brigade on Taiwan would bring a severe backlash from Beijing. However, it would be by far the most effective method of deterring or countering an attack because there is no substitute for being there from the first day of conflict. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Thompson. Boy, questions are pouring in. Great opening remarks that have folks really asking some great questions. So let's get to those before any further delay. First one's for Admiral Swift. And Scott, this one, they ask, we've heard you speak numerous times about the critical need to leverage capabilities through sensor agnostic and platform agnostic systems. Please explain.
Yeah, thanks for that question. My thinking on that actually originally came out of the work that you and I did together, along with the other commanders, component commanders there in Hawaii. I talked about how important it was to be a platform agnostic and sensor agnostic, that what we really needed to focus on is support weapons pairing to targets. I've added to that, we also need to be data agnostic. And it goes to your point, just saying we're joint isn't sufficient. I was struck by Tom's comments about long-range fires. Long-range fires are critical because we are at a disadvantage in a force-on-force fight in this conflict that we're talking about. Range matters, as does speed. And I describe speed more and more, less in the context of just being fast, but having velocity, speed with a direction. We've got to have a focus. So as the services procure systems, those systems need to move beyond interdependency, as you discussed, joint interdependency. We need to get to joint enablers. We need to be able to shoot on Army data. Army needs to be able to shoot its long-range fires on Navy data. We have a hard enough problem in inter-service collaboration. You know, for a while, we had target data that was being generated by one Navy platform that couldn't be used by another Navy platform. So this really gets to the needed velocity of the combined force in a pure competition, and we need to make sure that we move beyond this dependency and get to this space of being agnostic as to weapons. If one of the services developing a weapon, we need to make sure that the systems of the other services can fully utilize that weapon. I'll stop at that point. There's more on that subject that was actually called out in both Loren and Tom's comments, but I'll look for another opportunity to discuss that.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate any follow-up on that? No? Okay, another, appreciate that, a great answer. Here's a question from Patrick D. The Army is struggling with conveying the value of ground-based operational and strategic range fires with the U.S. Navy and U.S. Air Force. Does Indo-PACOM still support this ground-based leg of the long-range precision fire triad? And how can we help the Army with its messaging? But everyone talked about this. But you know, I think maybe some follow-up on thoughts on it would be very useful. A great question from Patrick.
Well, you know, I'm not sure it's still a triad, not because there's fewer options, but because they're proliferating. You know, we're now talking about extending the range of PRISM before we have even demonstrated it can get to its baseline range. We've got the long-range strategic cannon that will be tested in 2023. I think we're still going to test the hypervelocity weapon in 2023, but now we've got the mid-range capability, which will have an ability to hit targets with great precision 1,000 or more miles away. And the point is here that if we balance against that, what, for example, the Air Force is offering, it's got one hypersonic weapon under development that can be launched from a bomber. That's what it's got. And unfortunately, the bombers are all going to be nuclear capable, so there will be ambiguity about using them for conventional strikes against China. In the case of the Army, we have an entire portfolio of emerging long-range strikes that can be put on the first island chain and can be used not only separately, but also in combination with other joint fires in order to greatly complicate the military challenge that the People's Republic would face in any kind of conflict. So the Army becomes a pivotal capability in this context.
I would say I think I have a little bit different take. First of all, I don't care for the use of the word triad here. I think it because the questions about messaging, I think it's perhaps counterproductive. We don't want to start blurring some lines, the ambiguity in Congress and that sort of thing about what we're trying to do here. This is about conventional fires. And I think we should be helpful to avoid the word triad in the messaging about this. I would also say I think the kudos to General Rafferty for trying to extend the range of the PRISM. I think PRISM is going to very quickly become the mainstay of the field artillery fires. I think that's just going to have all kinds of utility for targeting in multiple domains, and I think it'll be here in mass and sooner than some of the other things. So I think continuing to emphasize the conventional fires character of this is going to be really important, so that we don't have to escalate in some of those other ways.
Great answer, Scott. Anything to add?
Yeah, I would say just, and this is an add to the great points that have been brought up already. I do think that, as I mentioned before, new doctrine doesn't need to be developed, and I give General Thurman credit for my thinking on this. That actually came about based on discussions that he and I had when I was a 7th Fleet commander, and I was working for him when we were assigned in support of operations on and exercises on the Korean Peninsula. And that is that in order to optimize these fires, and I would agree that the focus is on conventional fires, that we need to be less concerned about the point of origin and more focused on the point of impact or effect. And the concept here is that, and this is where the Marines are with their current thinking, and I think the other services are headed in this direction with a deeper understanding that using a JOA analogy, if you own a JOA, whoever the commander is in charge of that JOA. It's their fire cell that control the fires. The point of origin, they could be STRATCOM, conventional fires from STRATCOM, keeping it at the conventional level, or from another commander that is operating outside the JOA. But if that commander has weapons that can bring effect inside the JOA, then it's synchronized through that common fire cell. And now we're back to the importance of having common targeting data. How do you develop DIMPs? And then who owns those fires? It's that commander that owns those fires. A lot of the problem we have is that point of origin, that you've got to be far enough, talking about A2AD, you've got to be far enough away to generate the fire, but the fire has to be proximate to the leading edge of contention. That FIBA in the broad context. So I do think we can take advantage of fires that we have now, and that helps reinforce the importance of getting after both range and speed with the fires, velocity, if you will, with the fires that we're pursuing and developing.
All terrific points. I dealt with this when I was going through 4-star JTF certification by Indo-Pacom in the Pacific, and we actually started to adjust some of the things you were talking, Scott. To get those effects, we went really from what was the air tasking order to really a multi-domain tasking order to synchronize and converge these effects that everyone is discussing here. And having those multiple options, that ability to do that gave a great advantage, and in fact enabled again the air to get within range because of the friendly A2AD umbrella that was created. So just great points and all that. Thanks very much. Another question from Frank T. That's a really good one. And he says, gentlemen, the problem of distance and time have always bedeviled U.S. strategy in the Pacific. The tyranny of distance, no doubt about it. Tell me how you would approach thinking about Taiwan's defenses and the forward deployment of U.S. forces and capabilities in the context of potential Chinese fait accompli. What are your greatest concerns about providing an uninterrupted flow of troops and logistics during a time of conflict? Loren, you kind of answer. I'm going to skip you and come back to you at the end, but let's start. Tom, do you want to?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very difficult to have that uninterrupted flow. They're going to do their darndest to interrupt that flow, and that's why I think having as much stuff pre-positioned or in a position to island hop or scatter, but getting as much over there and to be able on indications or warning or something like that, move things around. I think maintaining that super long line is not not a really good strategy.
All three of you touched on that. Really, the ability, the present. You have to be present to compete, and it's a competition every day. Scott, any thoughts on that with Taiwan?
Not only is it competition, but it's also both Tom and Loren brought this up. It's deterrence. The conflict happens when deterrence fails, and so it's really important that deterrence is relevant in the eyes of those that you're trying to deter. They are the ultimate decision makers of whether deterrence is relevant or not. I give credit to the component commanders and Indo-Pacom commanders, both the current commander and the previous two that you and I both work closely with. I see the Air Force on the distributed basing side as getting after this problem set, remaining a relevant force in what is described as A2AD. I don't think that's well understood. A2AD is not this iron curtain. The Army can operate underneath that umbrella, as can the Air Force, as can the Navy, as can the Marines. We just need to think about it differently. And then, of course, the Marines are pursuing the EAB strategy of operating in that space. But I do think that we have to take an asymmetric approach to the defense of Taiwan. I think it's also important to note that it is the hardest thing. The only thing harder than defending against an amphibious landing is conducting an amphibious landing. Taiwan is terrible geography for conducting an amphibious landing. We also have to be concerned about the missile attack. So whether it's an inside force, as Loren was advocating for, whether it's a distributed force that the Air Force and the Marine Corps is pursuing, I think it's really important to think about the problem set strategically, and then take a more informed look at what the risk is. This is not a fait accompli. The China problem is much more difficult than those that would choose to counter China's approach, which, as you pointed out, is more about the international rules-based order. And it's really important that we take a whole of government approach to it. That is, all of this ties into that broader context of the defense of Taiwan.
Great points. Loren, I'll let you follow up.
Sure. Well, I would just add one caveat to that about the geography of Taiwan. Setting aside the issue of whether we would have air control or sea control in a future conflict, an amphibious landing is much harder from the west, if, for example, if it was U.S. Marines, than it would be from the east. The China-facing part of Taiwan is a coastal plain, and it's where virtually everybody on the island lives. From the west, you've got 5 different mountain ranges to negotiate. It would be an extremely hard landing if it was feasible at all. But I think the more important point is we can't proceed on the assumption that this is going to be a long war. Maybe it would be. The more likely possibility is if the Chinese are bold enough to attack Taiwan, they're going to try to present us with a fait accompli in a very brief amount of time. So if we're not already there, there's a high likelihood we're not going there.
Great points. A question on Japan. It's considered one of the U.S. strongest allies in the Pacific. What critical roles do they play in the current and future competition space with China? Let me start with you, Scott.
Yeah, well, I would. There's a lot of countries I would throw into that bin. I think the first thing, and just being blunt here, is I think countries in the region, as I talk to my many friends there, the perspective is that the United States has taken a step back. It remains to be seen whether these current initiatives continue to move back into that space. But I think the result of that is that you see the free and open Indo-Pacific initiative from Japan. That started back in 2016 when Japan started to be concerned about the commitment of the United States. That was followed up by a paper in 2019 from State Department reinforcing that free and open Pacific. I think Australia is making meaningful strides forward in consequential ways. I think Korea is as well. I think Taiwan is to be commended. Vietnam is another country that comes to my mind. India is certainly. So it's not just Japan. But what makes Japan unique is the long relationship that we have had with the Japanese since the end of World War II, and the consequential position that they occupy. We've just had that discussion about Taiwan, but the same is certainly true in the Japanese culture as they look at the challenges they face around the Senkakus. So I think they remain a critical partner. They have for a long time. They're thinking about the problems they have strategically. They're developing meaningful operational plans that optimize the tactical resources that they have. So I think they've become even a more critical partner in the last 4 years with respect to how they're thinking. And I think somewhat of an example for us to follow.
Yeah, clearly a critical ally. Thanks, Scott. Great points. Any follow-up?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would give the administration credit for sending over a delegation to Japan early, but also for receiving the Japanese Prime Minister as the first state visit to the White House. That's a big deal. It was a big deal to the Japanese as well, and they felt it. But getting kind of down to the details here, look, Japan, I think is likely to get spooked if the Chinese continue to push on Taiwan in the way that they have been. And so there's a lot of cooperation there. Japan is rethinking its Aegis Ashore things, but they've got the Aegis combat system. And in whatever configuration it is, Aegis Ashore, afloat, or whatever it is, there's lots of interesting VLS tubes. The wonderful thing about VLS tubes is they can carry many, many wonderful things. And so I will believe that we are really serious about our FMS opportunities that have expanded over the last few years, when we see not just the folks of Japan pursuing hypersonic counterattack of their own, but cruise missiles as well, but also the Australians. The Australians have really had a sea change in the past, I guess, 12 months, 18 months or so with their new defense guidance and the like, with some very ambitious doubling down on their defense strategy, including air defense and long-range strike as well. So really, both of them. You also see, frankly, the fact that Vietnam is standing up a rocket force. I mean, the demand signal, again, for offensive and defensive fires within all of our friends and allies there, that's going great guns, and I think it's going to be important to continue to sustain it.
I share Tom's concern that the Japanese might get spooked. The chief has made the point that where we station the Army in the Pacific is largely a political decision because it requires host nations' assent. We shouldn't automatically assume that U.S. bombers will be able to fly out of Japan, or that the U.S. Army will be able to operate in the first island chain between Taiwan and Japan, almost all of which islands are part of Japanese territory. I'm not saying they won't, but it's kind of like the situation that Britain and France faced in the Second World War with regard to the Low Countries. Maybe they'll be cooperative and maybe they won't. So we had better have options for proceeding with the defense of Taiwan, even in the absence of their support.
Well, let me thank our panel. We made a huge mistake here, though. We should have left an hour for questions. Just tremendous discussion and very rich discussions, and we could peel the onion back on all these and go on for another hour. But unfortunately, we don't have that kind of time. But I would ask, if you send in, a lot of folks sending in questions, if you can add your email to the question, we'll get you an answer. I just hate to leave so many folks with questions out there. But Admiral Swift, thank you. Really appreciate. So great to see you. And thank you for joining us. Just really added a lot here in person. Tom, Loren, thanks so much.
Good to be here.
Tremendous comments, and really glad you're here. And again, I apologize. We needed more time for questions, but we'll try to get those and get them to you, answer them as best we can. But really terrific discussion. So before we close, I do want to inform the audience of some of our upcoming events. Our next webinar is an AUSA noon report tomorrow, 24 June, on the FY22 Army budget featuring Major General Paul Chamberlain, Brigadier General Mac McCurry, and Colonel Chris Schneider. We've already got over 800 folks signed up for that. It'll be a great event tomorrow. Join us. 29 June, we'll host an AUSA Thought Leaders webinar featuring Colonel Tom Vossler, U.S. Army retired, and Dr. Jeff McCausland, authors of Battle Tested: Gettysburg Leadership Lessons for 21st Century Leaders, sponsored by Defense One. On 8 July, we will host another AUSA Thought Leaders webinar featuring a warrant officer panel discussion. That should be great. And don't forget to save the date. We'll be back in person with the annual meeting, 11 to 13 October. It's going to be the best one ever. Don't miss it. Everybody's so excited about getting back together. And stay tuned for registration details coming up. That'll open up 15 July. We're very excited. Hope to see you there. Not that this virtual stuff isn't great, but it'll be much better to be back in person, no doubt about it. So thanks again for joining us. Have a great Army Day.